An apple tree is just like a person. In order to thrive, it needs companionship that's similar to it in some ways, but quite different than others. Jeffrey Stepikoff. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I hope everyone's having a good week and weekend so far, depending on when you're listening to this. I know that I had mentioned last week's episode that the one coming up next week might be slightly delayed. I think I should be able to have it out at the regular time. I'm planning on recording it before I leave town Wednesday this coming week, so hopefully it will be up at our regular time next Monday, but worst case, it may be up that time on Tuesday, but we should be good. Didn't really have too much feedback from the last episode, at least no questions, although I did make a mistake myself, which I'm going to be pointing out here in a moment. But I would like to thank everyone for listening and who has continued to listen. And I hope you will enjoy this episode and share, let friends know, that kind of thing. So, this week we will be continuing our study of humans at 8,000 to 6,000 BCE, and we're going to be looking at the peoples living in Central Asia. Now, I'll be defining what I mean by that term shortly, so expect some geography and environmental talk in this episode, maybe a little bit more than normal, but at least in comparison to what we talk about with humans. But I do think it is necessary, and it will, of course, help us when we get to this region in future episodes. And that is one thing I need to correct from last week. I said that we wouldn't be talking about what is now modern Kazakhstan this week. Well, I rechecked my notes and my maps, and I will be talking about areas that make up the majority of what this country is. So I apologize for being a bit dumb, but I think that kind of thing shows that even someone who has a passion for things like history and geography and maps and spends a lot of time studying them can have blind spots or areas where the perceptions are a little skewed. And now, I don't know about most parts of the world, but I don't remember Central Asia ever really being discussed in primary school or grade school, as it's known in the U.S., unless it was in relation to either the USSR, the Mongolian Empire, or the Russian Empire. You know, one of those three is usually when it's brought up. And even in college, I don't recall many courses associated with that region specifically. I had some classes on things like the Ottoman Empire and like early Indian civilizations, and there was a lot of talk about their various interactions with the peoples living in the region. But I don't recall any classes or courses that were focused on the region from the people who lived there's points of view. And while I have done my own reading and studying since then, I still have large gaps in my knowledge when it comes to this region. So it is one I am looking forward to learning a lot about, and letting you guys know what I've learned, and maybe us talking about it and learning about it together. So with that kind of out of the way, let us get back to it and let us define where we are in the world. So we ended last week after speaking about Turkmenistan and the Yaytun sites of the Kopet Dag Mountains. It is these mountains that form the southwestern boundary of Central Asia. The eastern banks of the Caspian Sea and around that to the northern tip until you reach, I think it's the Buzan River in the west, which is a tributary of oh, forgive me, I believe it's the Volga, but it may also be the Don. I didn't write that down, but it is part of the I guess the delta that feeds into the Caspian Sea. And everything south of the Ural Mountains and the Siberian forests is the northern border. And this is located kind of in, again, modern-day Kazakhstan. The eastern border is made up of a number of mountain ranges. From north to south, these are the Altai and the Tian Shan and the Pamir mountains. The southern border is the Hindu Kush mountain range. So the modern countries that exist in this spaces are Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Afghanistan. Now, a relatively small portion of Kazakhstan's far north is outside this region, as is most of Afghanistan. There is also a small part of it, I guess, it's kind of maybe more in the region of maybe what we could consider Persia. Basically, there's a gap between the Hindu Kush and Persia's eastern mountains. It's where the city of Herat is located, and that's kind of an oasis town, but it's kind of outside Central Asia. It's not quite south of the Hindu Kush, so it maybe is not part of what people would consider South Asia or India, or the Indian subcontinent, but it's also kind of to the periphery of Persia. So that is an area that's going to be, much like Afghanistan, kind of be difficult to nail down. Depending on when we're referring to talk about Afghanistan, we'll wait until we get to talking about South Asia and the Indian subcontinent. But as time progresses and more discernible cultures and civilizations form, emerge, and evolve or dissolve, Afghanistan shall begin to belong more to Central Asia, culturally at least, if not geographically. And that's something that's not going to just affect Afghanistan. There are other places that will sometimes be more in the cultural sphere of, say, East Asia, and then other times it may be more in the cultural sphere of Asia. Pardon for that pause there. I had a video rendering in the background, or one of my uploads to YouTube, and it finished and began playing the episode. So you guys are about to hear an old one interlaced with the current one. Forgive me for that. But yes, so again, certain times, certain peoples may fit more culturally, or at least more actively with different regions, despite them, being geographically closer to other groups. And then there's sometimes they're equally interacting between both, and that's just one of those things we'll have to deal with when we get to. So most of Afghanistan is going to be discussed next week, but there are some places where people are inhabiting that we will talk about this week. For now, though, to start the actual, I guess, talk about the groups of people living in this region at this point in our timeline, we should start with the northern part of Central Asia and in the mountains that make up its eastern boundary. Now, at various points in time that we've talked about before, these areas were boxed in by glaciers, ice sheets, things like that. And during the last glacial maximum, and to a lesser extent by the Younger Dryas, this was the case. This made the region much harder for humans to live in and travel through, due to the nature of course, these close ice sheets and an actual desert covering most of the west of this part of the region, with the exception of what's around the Caspian Sea coast. It makes it kind of not the best place to want to try and eke out a hunter-gathering existence. It's not good for animals because there's not much vegetation, and of course, humans at this point in time are getting most of their daily calories again from gathering. So you're low on both plants and animals, which again, not the best way for a hunter-gatherer to live. But by 8000 BC, these barriers had retreated enough to allow for much easier travel and then later trade to pass through the region. Not to mention fresh water sources being released from some of the mountains, the glaciers that stayed on those mountains, and of course from the melting ice sheets to the north. In fact, a lot of these mountains still have unconnected glaciers. They're not part of an Arctic Circle or anything. They still exist year round. And these barriers contributed to separating the eastern hunter-gatherers and the Proto-Siberians. So it's keeping Eastern Europe and Siberia and Northeast Asia and the peoples living in those regions separate from each other. And this kind of helps them, I guess, develop differently in terms of appearance and technologies and things like that. So once these sheets are going away, that's going to begin to change. You're going to see an influx of peoples from both regions move to this region and interact and trade, interbreed or intermarry, fight some types of conflicts with each other. All that good old-fashioned human behavior. And from what sources I can find, this region is just beginning to see this influx of people move in. And based on DNA tests of modern people and some remains found around this region that are dated to this time, people... it was primarily Proto-Siberian, North Asian hunter-gatherers mixed in with these European Eastern hunter-gatherers. There's a fairly decent split between ancestry there. And this is a pattern that you're going to see repeated in some form or another for virtually all of recorded history. Different groups coming in from Asia, different groups coming in from Europe, them moving out, and then some of their descendants or cousins moving in, and then them reconnecting or breeding or whatever you want to call it. Now, for these people that are just arriving, and they would be arriving right around the start of this period, right? 8000 BC is by the point that these ice caps in Europe have gone, and you're beginning to see the glaciers in these mountains melt and really feeding the water sources from the mountains. So there's not a huge number, at least initially, although because of some of the water sources and the easier travel, it is going to populate relatively quickly. And, it's not going to be the most heavily populated region, but it will have a sizable population. It's not near abandoned. So these new arrivals would be dealing with, a much different environment from the Eurasian steppe. But after a period of adjustment, the region probably becomes much more desirable than where they were living beforehand, which again helps kind of draw people in from those regions specifically, whereas your neighbors to the south might not view the environment as a draw. There might be things that could be found there in terms of material goods or material wealth that are going to be much more desirable than the environment from people living in, say, India or the Caucasus or Persia. Sorry, I lost my place in my notes here. So it isn't a perfect environment, as there is, again, that sizable desert, but there were ways around it, and eventually, several episodes from now, ways through it. But I should point out that there were some people living in the area prior to this in-migration. Though these remains have been dated to a period between the last glacial maximum and the start of the Younger Dryas, which was sometime between 20 and 13,000-ish years ago. DNA was retrievable from, I think it was a set of male remains, and the tests show that this person living in Central Asia and whoever he was living with were cousins of the ancestors of peoples that now live on the Tibetan plateau, native Tibetans and Sherpas. And no DNA tests of any population living today show that they descend from this man's remains. This branch of the human family, at least as far as we have discovered so far, does not have modern descendants. Now, why this man and his people died out is hard to say, with 100% certainty, as we only, again, have a very small number of remains, and his, I think, is the most recent one that has been found. I think there's some that are slightly older, but they're a little bit harder to, I guess, date, and I don't think their DNA was successfully tested. So it's possible that they were cut off from, enough food sources due to the glaciers in the eastern mountains kind of coming up maybe during the beginning of the Younger Dryas or, during that last glacial maximum period. And that then, because of the glaciers in the east, they couldn't really cross the deserts like the Karakum, which is the main desert covering the middle of this region. Or perhaps they were able to cross the region, but were fought back by the peoples living in what will become either, Persia, Middle East, or, Southern Asia. And I should point out that there is evidence of a potential genetic bottleneck for modern-day Sherpas and Tibetans that, show that this was a problem that every single one of these branches of these populations had, really hard times living and keeping their numbers up. So there's a drop all across people, that descended from, I guess, this proto-Tibetan Sherpa source. But by the time you get to about 9,000 years ago, at least the people living in Tibet, their population stabilizes and then, continues to grow normally as you would expect for hunter-gatherers. So, they do bounce back. They're not wiped out completely. They may have been able to finally adapt to kind of this mountainous, frigid environment. Now, due to the late arrival or re-arrival of people to this region, and again, very small numbers were coming in right around the start of this timeline, and probably The most advantageous aspects of the environment were still growing and developing. Things like the animal population and plant diversity was probably just beginning to kind of explode and repopulate areas where water is available. So this region does not have any evidence of early towns or agriculture until after the 6000 BCE part of our current timeline. Though I should make it clear that these people are not dumber or more primitive. They're just coming into a vastly different region than what they were used to, and they were probably more focused on much more urgent matters. Things like learning which of these new plants can be eaten, which are medicinal and which are poisonous, and probably having to develop new hunting tactics based on their geography and any type of different animals that were in the region. They'd also have to deal with venomous snakes, which this region is home to, I think, outside of Australia, some of the most venomous and the most varied, I guess, or most numerous different species of venomous snakes. Excuse me. I had the next video just finish rendering, and I was panicking to stop it before it showed up on the audio, so that got me a little jumbled there. Though, yes, so again, they're just doing a whole lot with a very alien environment, and so I have no doubt that this was a huge cultural and every other type of shock you can imagine to coming into this region. So I did do a little bit of research, and it is one thing that I was looking up, and that was about the wild varieties of grains or grasses, things like legumes that were in the area. So the people there did have local strains of these type of plants, but I could not see that there were any, domesticated versions of these plants or any attempts to domesticate them. So a lot of these wild sources appear to have been replaced much later, in a couple of thousand years, by some of these domestic strains that are imported to the region. They also did have types of wild sheep and goats. In fact, I think the goats that were living here, I think the largest variety of goat is native to the mountains out in the east. But there was not, as far as I'm aware, any attempt to domesticate these local varieties. Now, that is not to say that they didn't attempt something like that, but if they did, it isn't apparent in the historical record. So all these wild varieties of plants and animals, they were definitely probably very important and vital to survival in the region, but probably due to the nature and the time frame of people moving in, they're probably replaced or supplanted by these much easier to control domestic strains that come in. Though peoples will continue to hunt the wild goats and sheep even after they have domestic varieties. This is a form of recreation. Later, once you get to a sedentary society or a semi-sedentary society, as the case is in this region, and it is also a practice of fighting and types of warfare. So that is not going away even after the domestic animals come in. But there is one food product that the people living in this region do have a hand in domesticating and spreading, and that is the apple. Their trees grew wild around the eastern Caspian coasts, and I mentioned this in passing, I think, on the last episode covering this region, but I believe I left it out of the plant domestication episode because it was not in the first wave of domestication attempts. I will be talking about that more in our next domestication special. And there is also another animal that will be domesticated in this region. And I'm jumping way ahead here, but that is the Bactrian camel. That comes from this region, and Bactrian camels are the two-humped variety, and they were probably domesticated in what is now Kazakhstan. But that's later. And this is not the only place camels are domesticated. The other type of camel, which I can't remember off the top of my head, the one-humped camel is domesticated slightly earlier, but in a different part of the world. These were probably semi-simultaneous domestication events. But again, we'll get to that in future episodes. Now, apples and their seeds were probably used as type of trade items, along with other local materials to get domesticated seeds or animals from their neighbors in Iran and India, probably along with raiding or finding like maybe lost or abandoned animals or fields. Now, once these domestic strains arrive or are passed through the region, we begin to see true permanent settlements begin to be spread throughout the region. Though these settlements will remain relatively small, though, as nomadic pastoralists will be more favored form of living in this region. But this combination of lifestyles, along with the region's central location, and make it a major crossroad for all types of transmissions: cultural, religious, genetic transmission, material, wealth, all that kind of good stuff. It's going to be very important to the development of not just this region, but the regions that surround it. So just keep that in mind. There's also a number of rivers through the eastern portion. The Oxus River, which is now known as the Arnu Darya. And we'll talk about that more later because it is important to what is now modern Afghanistan, and as well as a couple of other places to the north of that. But that does help facilitate trade as well as travel from what is now India, so southern Asia. And that region is probably a little bit more developed, at least technologically speaking, as well as when it comes to agriculture or plant domestication. But we're going to get into that again next week for our episode focusing on, or beginning to focus on, South Asia, which again takes up basically the middle and southern part of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, those countries. And maybe as well, I might stick in what is now Bhutan and Nepal, though I don't believe that they have anything that is, necessary to have full episodes on. They may get kind of swept up to the Tibetan Plateau episode, but I have a feeling that the South Asian episode should probably be at least 2 or 3 weeks, if not more. It'll depend, I guess, on how much time I have next week to record, and we'll take it from there. But I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I'd like to thank anyone who is listening here who may have been subscribing on YouTube or listening there. I've been still in the middle of uploading my backlog. I've not been quite as diligent about it as I would have liked, but I have the last couple of weeks I've put up about 2 or 3 episodes a week. So we're finally into season 3, and I'm now doing those October episodes, and the episode discussing Conan the Barbarian has been extremely popular. I have a little over 20 subscribers right now, and within 3 days, I've had over 150, views on that, or listens to that episode there. So, huge episode on YouTube, as well as it's still one of my more popular episodes just on the feed. So, if you have been listening there, thank you, and of course, thank you for listening here. If you are interested, or if you have the time, please do like, share, all that stuff to whatever the options are for whatever platform you listen to. Please drop the like, the follow, whatever, the subscription. I really do appreciate it. It's helping me try to get more people listening, and just grow the podcast. But I'll go ahead and call that here. If you have any questions or feedback, you can reach me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on Twitter, which I'll include the link to that in the episode description, or you can reach out to me. You can comment on any of the YouTube episodes, and I can respond there. So thank you all for listening. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Have a good day. Goodbye.